Hey y'all, and welcome back to my channel. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to epoxy a rolling pin. I had a friend looking for one that's not only useful for baking, but also decorative. So she texted me and said, hey, is it possible to epoxy these? That really got my wheels turning, and I immediately went into the market for a good quality rolling pin. All the ones that I found at my local stores were not really good quality. The wood did not feel really great on them, and it's not something that I would want to put a lot of time and effort into and not be providing an excellent quality product, just as I do with my Steel Magnolia tumbler blanks. These that I found on Amazon just really wowed me compared to what I had found in my local stores. They are excellent quality. It does not feel like it's going to fall apart. The handles do not flex or bend around on them. It spins really well. Now you may be wondering, how on earth do these attach to our turners so our epoxy does not just fall off? I will get to that here in just a second, but first let's get these prepped to glitter. I used a piece of either 220 or 320 grit sandpaper and focused on the center of this rolling pin. I don't want to go over the edge because we are not going to put epoxy over the edge. We're going to focus on getting any of those oils and just really the sheen that it had on top of that center. Get that off so that we have a good surface for our paints or epoxy to adhere to. And normally whenever I'm prepping my tumblers, I do that over a sink with some running water. Anytime I do a board or anything that is with wood, I try to avoid adding too much water because the wood can absorb some of the water and it may or may not be dry whenever you put your paint or epoxy on, and that can cause issues. So I just wet my sandpaper, sanded the rolling pins, and then dried that off with a towel, and I'm good to move on to the next step. Now we want to prevent these from spinning around, so I'm going to take some painter's tape and start right at the base of the handle and work all the way up. One, to protect it from getting scratched by our attachment that we are going to use, as well as protect those handles from getting any epoxy or spray paints on them, and again, keep the rolling pin from rolling. We're going to do two different designs. One, I'm going to use a gold glitter, so we're just going to leave it as a wood base. And the other, we're going to use a blue, and I want this to look like a vintage blue. So we're using Latte and Sky Color Fix paints from Colorflex. We're going to mix those together and give this 2 coats of paint. And I just used my heat gun in between those coats to dry it up really quickly so that we can move on into our next step. I'm avoiding going over the edge of the rolling pin. If you do happen to get any paint over the edge, make sure you do clean that up with these Color Fix paints. They're really easy to clean up, but they are also excellent coverage, paint, primer, and a glue all in one. So if any does decide to make its way over the edge, just grab yourself a baby wipe or a warm rag and wipe off that excess so that you don't have to clean it up later. Now, I was so excited to start these. I did start them before I got my attachment in the mail. So I did find that this nifty little Turner arm holder from CAMIPAIGE Boutique held the handle of the rolling pin perfectly so I could sit it to the side to dry. Once it was dry, I grabbed about a milliliter of Artistry's 1:1 ratio facet epoxy. This is my favorite method for applying any glitter. It dries super fast and you're able to do a second coat only after about 30 minutes, so I can quickly go into giving that glitter its first coat of epoxy. So just as our paint, we're avoiding going over the edge. You just want to take your epoxy to the edge of the center of the rolling pin, not over it. And then after I had all of my epoxy on, I went over and just dabbed all around to get any streaks out of the epoxy so I can immediately move into adding my glitter. We did the exact same thing on the wooden one. I did find that it soaked in the epoxy just a little, so I believe I used a tiny bit more epoxy for this one just to make sure that I had good coverage and enough for my glitter to stick to. For our wooden one, we're using Queen Bee from PDB Creative Studio. This is a gorgeous gold mix. We're just going to dump that all over the epoxied portion of this rolling pin. And then once I'm done conveniently, I can just roll this onto the paper and get all of that glitter nice and flat. And then once I have the glitter all over the rolling pin, I'm going to grab a clean glove and go over the edges so that I pull off any of the chunky pieces hanging over the side. And that's going to help eliminate some heavy sanding around the edges so we don't damage our wood. We're going to repeat those steps by using Ocean Eyes, also from PDB Creative Studio, on our blue rolling pin. So now that we have got to the point of needing to epoxy these rolling pins, after I received them in the mail and started brainstorming on how we could design these, the biggest thing was how are we going to attach these to our turner so they can spin. Luckily, I have some incredible friends over at CAMIPAIGE Boutique. I reached out to Brooke and Nick and said, hey, can we get a tool to make this work? Not only did Nick create something that was going to hold this rolling pin, it is pretty universal. I tried all of the other rolling pins in it, and since they have the little thumb screws on the side of each of the attachments, it's adjustable on this turner arm. These rolling pins are heavier than a typical tumbler, so these attachments are super lightweight while also being heavy duty and excellent quality. He also kept in mind that it's kind of difficult to hold a rolling pin, especially attached to a turner arm, so he put feet on the bottom of each of these attachments so it is self-supporting and makes working on these rolling pins a breeze. Now, these attachments will not fit on your standard turner arm, so each of these attachments comes with a custom 18-inch turner arm so that it can hold the rolling pin comfortably on your turner. I have a quick connect turner from Artistry Epoxy. So this one has a thumb screw that helps me just pop it right on my turner and tighten that down. And they also offer all of the other types of attachments for all different kinds of turners. There's enough tension in these attachments to hold the rolling pin and keep it from spinning while on your turner. However, it is loose enough, if that makes sense, for you to free spin it yourself and apply your epoxy or whatever for your design. At the time of this tutorial, they are launching at CAMIPAIGEBoutique.com, and you can use code Brittany10 to save you 10% off of your order for your attachment or any of the other incredible tools that they offer on their website. We're going to give both this one and our blue rolling pin a coat of epoxy, and when they cure, we're going to go over with a piece of sandpaper to make sure that they are nice and smooth, and then we will add a second layer of epoxy before adding on our stencils. We got our glitter to lay super flat, so that helps eliminate putting too much epoxy on these. Now, of course, the layers of epoxy, until your rolling pin is smooth, it can vary depending on how much epoxy you use and the viscosity of it. I used about 15 milliliters of Artistry's 1-to-1 ratio fast set. It is a thick viscosity epoxy, so that helps give great coverage over that initial glitter as well. Now, while working on these, you want to make sure that you get really nice and even coverage of your epoxy. I am not using one, I'm just using a piece of sandpaper, but you can find some palm sanders, just handheld, that's not electric. Those will help you get nice and even coverage, as well as an electric palm sander. We have got to make sure that these are extra smooth and there are no ripples in our epoxy. I'm sure things like this will be a huge hit around the holidays, and people may be using them to bake some pies, and we cannot have any added stress of a wonky pie crust, okay? So make sure you give attention to those edges too. And once you have this nice and smooth, give it another coat of epoxy so it be glossy for us to add on our decals, or our stencils rather. All of these stencils and images that I'm using are from Creative Fabrica, and I will have everything listed down below so you can easily find them. Once I have my poinsettias pulled into Design Space, I'm going to measure the dimensions of my rolling pin and then create a shape with those exact dimensions so I can lay out and make sure that I get my stencils sized correctly. Now do remember, if you have any hangover on any of the edges, especially the top and the bottom, or if you're working on a tumbler from side to side, make sure that you account for that on the opposite side because we're working with a round surface. Once all of those stencils are in place, remove that shape and then highlight all of your stencils so that you can keep them together and attach. This will cut them exactly how you place them so that you can remove all of that excess vinyl and easily wrap it around your rolling pin. We're going to do the exact same thing with our snowflakes, and I will show you the process just sped up a bit so you can see that as well. Once I have both of those complete, I'm going to cut them using a temporary removable vinyl so it does not leave any residue behind on our rolling pins whenever we remove them. We're going to apply this as a full wrap using the hinge method, just as we would on a tumbler. Once you have your stencils on, make sure that you do trim off any of that excess that may be hanging over the sides, because once we have our stencils on, we are going to take some tape and cover up that exposed wood so we don't get any spray paint there. After you place your painter's tape around that side, trim off as close to the edge as you possibly can so that you can get full coverage of your spray paint. Of course, we did the exact same thing with our poinsettias over the gold glitter, and we used Rust-Oleum light gray for this one, and we used Rust-Oleum vintage blush over our gold glitter. And once that dried, just went over and removed all of the stencils. Once we have all of those stencils removed, we're going to head back over to Creative Fabrica and download a couple of some Christmas clip art images, import them over into our design space, and start creating our decals. We're going to lay these out exactly the same way as we did our stencil by creating a shape the exact dimensions of our rolling pin and laying them over that shape. Now, since we are using print to cut feature, it will only allow you to print a certain size, meaning the dimensions of our area space we're working with is going to be too large to use that feature and attach all of these together. So we will lose our exact layout once we send this over to print. However, we will know that we have made them large enough and have enough of the images to fill up the full rolling pin. The Buttercrafts matte printable vinyl is my absolute favorite to use for these projects. It is super thin and smooth, so it cuts great. Just make sure that you have replaced your blade on your machine recently, or it is a newer blade, so that it has a sharp edge to cut through this paper and cut it clean. Now, the little cluster that I wanted to use for the focal point on this blue one had some sprigs on the edge, and I knew better to try to cut them, but I still tried anyway. And as you can see, they did not cut really well. It got pretty butchered because they are so thin. It's almost impossible to even cut it with, even if it was regular vinyl. I sort of wish that I would have went back and made this centerpiece a little larger since we took away those flourishes that were around the side, but in all, it still looked good. I just think it would have looked a little bit better if I would have went back and made it slightly bigger, but it's okay. So anyway, I went all over and just placed all of my small images. You do not have to seal this printable vinyl before you put it on the tumbler. Honestly, if you try that, it will create a mess. I think I just called this a tumbler. I'm so used to working on tumblers and doing tutorials on them. It's so nice to get a break from them here and there and offer customers a little something different in the shop, but I still want to call this a tumbler. To keep this rolling pin from rolling away while I was working on it, I grabbed my tumbler cradle from CAMIPAIGE Boutique and just placed the rolling pin down inside of that, and it worked perfect. When you are working with printable vinyl, you always want to seal it somehow. As I mentioned, you don't want to seal it as you would a water slide prior to removing it from your printable vinyl sheet, but you do want to seal it after you get that on your tumbler, or in this case, a rolling pin, whatever project you are working on. So rather than using a clear spray paint, we have some quick seal from Artistry Epoxy. This is obviously a thin liquid polyurethane coating that's going to really seal these in, and it kind of pulls around the edges just a tiny bit to keep everything from lifting. I know even sometimes whenever I use a clear spray paint, sometimes my vinyl still lifts. My printable vinyl can have little sprigs that may pop up if I'm doing some florals. That can be really frustrating, and this stuff prevents that. So once I have that on my tumbler, you can actually very quickly add on some additional details. So we're going to go in with Snowbound from Colorflex before it dries. Once I have sprinkled that all over, I'm just going to sort of tap those chunky bits down a bit and allow this to dry for about an hour before going in with my epoxy. Here is the images that we used for our pink rolling pin. I'm not going to show everything since we have already reviewed it with our blue one, but for this one I did create a Happy Holidays wording for the center using Wilderness typeface font, and I did create a 0.035 offset. After I got those situated, I print those images out and then cut our Happy Holidays out using the textured gold metallic vinyl from Tech Wrap Craft and just a light gray that I found at Hobby Lobby. You can't necessarily stand a rolling pin up to eyeball and get your decal straight, so I used my CAMIPAIGE Boutique tumbler cradle as a guide to help me place my Happy Holidays decal on and make sure that it is straight. After we got all of our printable vinyl on, I made sure once again that it was nice and flat and really stuck down to our rolling pin, and sealed that with our quick seal. And it was time to add on our final 2 coats of epoxy. Now, I loved this glitter so much, I did decide to actually add it into the final coat as well, or the first of the 2 final coats. Our images are cookies or like holiday desserts, and this glitter just really made me think of like sugar on top of a cookie. It just looked really pretty. So again, we added Snowbound from Colorflex into our epoxy. This is the first of our final 2. And again, make sure that you're getting nice, even, smooth coverage of your epoxy. If you have difficulty in getting fast set epoxy extra smooth, then I would suggest using a regular epoxy, since it does have a longer cure time and gives it more time to self-level. Again, when you are applying the epoxy, work from the center out. I put my epoxy in the center of my rolling pin and then drug it to the edge, but not over the edge, with my finger. I ran over this with my torch and popped it on my Artistry turner to dry. Now these are a little bit heavier, and of course you need the extra long turner arm. I do not have any issues with my turner being off level with these, because my Artistry turner does have some additional support legs on the bottom. However, if you do run into any issues, just grab something that is weighted and sit it on top of your turner to help give it a little more support and not tilt forward. After that coat dries, give it a nice level sand and a final coat. I literally cannot tell you how happy I am with the way that these turned out. I can imagine these just being gifted around the holidays, and you can really make these personal and sentimental by adding a recipe from a family member or a family name on them, photos around the holidays, and it's something that can be cherished and used for years to come. The epoxy that I use is food safe and FDA compliant, so you can use these for your baking needs. I just never suggest using them with hot foods, or of course cutting into the epoxy, which I don't think would be a concern for these, but I still disclose that to my customers. I hope that y'all love these as much as I do. Don't forget, the tool attachment for the rolling pin does drop today at the time of this tutorial, so run and grab yours now to get started on your holiday orders, or some pretty amazing ready to ship items. As always, all the materials that I have used will be listed down in the description below. Give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. That is all for today. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.